Okay, we've finished all of our setup. The last little bit of house cleaning here is we just need to turn the planes off on these symmetries so they aren't annoying to see and look at. Okay, so we've got all of our objects. Now let's go ahead and close all of these windows. And the one thing we're going to do at this point is we are going to go ahead and pull the leg spikes all the way down to the bottom. Just because they're going to be the only thing that is not included in our volume builder. And so in the past tutorial, we used the volume builder to make fog. In this case, we're going to be using it to merge all of these different objects into one cohesive object. So let's go ahead and click on the volume builder here. And then we are going to select all of our symmetries and the capsule. And we're going to drag them up and make them children of our volume builder. And as soon as we do that, you're going to see we get this beautiful result, which basically, right, if you're coming in and you haven't looked at other volume building tutorials, right, what the volume builder does is it basically turns your mesh into voxels. And the voxels are, right, a three-dimensional little cube. It looks crazy. If we were to try and render this right now, it would not render at all because there's no mesh whatsoever. It's just these little voxels, and these are used to make volumes, and you can do like fog and lighting and all sorts of crazy stuff with this. But in our case, we want to take this and turn this into a mesh. Now, to do that, surprisingly enough, we use something called the volume mesher. So let's go ahead and drop this to a volume mesher. And then what we need to do is we need to take our volume builder and make it a child of the volume mesher. Now, as soon as I do that, you're going to see that, one, I get like a much smoother result. You can see there's actually smoothing from the legs to the body. It's pretty exciting already. However, I've also completely lost the antenna entirely, right? And there's some weird geometry on this mesh. It's not working right, which is what we're going to use the remesher to solve in a little bit once we get the settings on this dialed. So as an intro to volume meshing or volume building, right, you'll notice if we have the volume builder selected, we have all of these different objects in here. These are essentially, you can think of these as layers and kind of how they unite together. It's sort of like a bool, but in a more smoothing and kind of trying to interpolate between the two different objects rather than just hard, cut corners. And so these are all set to union. I could, like if I was to say, oh, I actually want this to be subtracted, right? You can actually subtract things from a mesh as well, which in our case, we're not going to do right now, but it is a possibility. And you can create, right? And you can do mixes of unions and subtractions and only do things where they intersect. It's really, really powerful. But the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that our geometry is here. You can see we've got these little tiny things that are our antenna right now, and that's not going to work out for us. The issue is our voxel size is pretty big. So if I undo the volume mesher, if I turn that off for a hot second, and we see how big these voxels are, right? I'm going to go ahead and set this to 5. Oops. I don't know how I just turned on emoji, but right. So now if I set this to 5, you'll see that I get a better resolution mesh. And so if I turn my volume mesher back on, I've got a little bit more antenna coming up out of here. So now let's go ahead and we still have the volume builder selected. Let's set this to 2.5. Right. So at 2.5, you can see that I've got a lot more of these coming out. However, right, I'm starting to get some edges in here, right? You can see that this mesh is going. If I go down to 1, and I'm going to highly suggest that in most cases you do not go smaller than 1, because 1, you'll get a pop-up in your computer will say, hey, this is going to take a while to render or take a while to process. And then if you go too small, you will likely crash things in a hard way. But I also want you to note that, right, it becomes more faceted as we go because it's adhering more and more strongly to the original mesh. Now, the one thing to note is that now I actually have like pretty much the full length of this. However, this mesh is insanely dense And that is problematic on its own. So let's see if there's ways we can solve this without having the mesh be so tight. Let's go ahead and go back to, let's say we go back to 5 for now, right? At 5, everything but the antenna look good, right? Like, I actually like the way the legs are looking. I like the way these little legs are looking with the claws poking out of them, right? They're all looking pretty great. Everything's good except those antennae. So how are we going to resolve this? There's a couple things we can do, but the first and the most important is to use this SDF smooth. This button here, this is another type of layer. If I click on this, right, everything's going to be smoothed, like completely, right? Everything, all detail is gone. And what it's doing is it's like it's applying a blur filter to the geometry, right? Now, if I have my SDF smooth selected, you'll see I have the strength indicator, right? And I can have more or less strength on this, right? So that's one way that I can smooth geometry. So if I have this set to 0 and I set this to 2.5 instead, right? So now I have more antenna sticking out and everything, but it's still like, it's a little bit more faceted than I'd like. I could go ahead and smooth this down some, but you'll see that it is, right? And that's really helping most of the mesh, but again, it's shrinking my antenna. Okay, so one of the other things here, if I hold this down, you'll see this SDF smooth button. You'll see that there's also SDF dilate and erode. If I choose that, everything plumps out, right? And you can see that I've got these antennae that are much, fatter because I have this 5 set offset. If I increase this iterations, it's going to get even more plump than it is currently. I can also adjust the strength, but again, what I would like is somewhere in all these settings to be able to have it be thick enough here that these show, but not increase the thickness here. Now, let's go ahead and turn off our smooth for a second. So now without the smooth on there, right, this dilation has allowed us to have the entire length of our antenna. They're just enormous, right? And so what I'd like is if I could only apply this to the antenna. I don't need to dilate anything else. So let's go ahead and see if we can make that happen. So I'm going to move this smooth all the way up to the top. I could delete it for now just by selecting it and hitting delete on the keyboard. But what I can do is, much like in Photoshop or something, I can have a folder that houses these different layers, and then the effects of the layers are kind of self-contained. They don't affect the entire thing. So if I click this little plus sign here to create a folder, and then I select my dilate and erode, and symmetry 1, or symmetry and symmetry 1, these are my antenna, and I drag all 3 of these up into my folder, you'll see that I have that they are separated from the rest of this body. However, there's an issue here, right? They aren't having any effect, and that's because dilate and erode is the bottom layer. If I move that up and make it the top, now I have these thick antennae, my normal mesh, and everything else is working well. If I select the front legs or the top one that's not inside this folder and click SDF smooth, right, I can now potentially smooth this a little bit, right? Maybe not that full amount, but I can pull this down until I'm happy with the smoothness of the rest of this mesh, and I'm not losing anything on these antennae. And then I can go up to this dilate and erode, and right, this strength or the offset is a little bit much. So maybe I can set this to, let's try 2.5 centimeters. That's getting it back closer to the original mesh. Something you just want to make sure of, the big test is how thin can I make this, and I'm going to use my strength now, before I really start losing things, right? You can see as I go smaller, things start to separate and get lost, and that's going to be problematic when we go to remesh this. But for me, and with my model, the way I set it up, if the voxel size is 2.5 centimeters, and the dilate and erode offset is set to 2.5, and the strength is set to 75%, then I have a pretty good result. Now, they are probably a little thicker than they need to be in reference to the actual caterpillar. So if I pop over here and take, oops, oh my lord. If I pop over here and take a look, right, they are still a little bit big at the base. And I could either try to reduce that dilation, or I might just go ahead and take my circles and say, oh, let's make this like 4 instead. And I'll do the same thing for this other one, and let's just see what we get. If I say 4 here, then right, I'm going to have a narrower base, but the tips are still coherent and seem to be working. Okay, now let's go ahead and look at the bottom of our model real quick. There's one other area that we need to make an adjustment to that we didn't do earlier, and that is our legs, right? These legs should be suction cuppy, and we haven't done that yet. So let's go ahead and turn off a whole bunch of these things. Let's turn off the volume builder and volume mesher, and we're going to go ahead and go to we're going to start with our mid legs. I'm going to select this cone, and I need to find out where that cone is hanging out in space. If I turn off the cloner, you'll see that I can actually see the leg. And if you can't see it, if you left it at 0, 0, it's somewhere in the body of your model, you can always hide or just go into solo mode temporarily. So all you can see is this. Whatever you have selected is what you see. And so I've got this selected. I could probably even turn off the symmetry temporarily. And what I want to do is I want to basically, right, I want to use the extrude tool to push up in here so I can actually have a suction cupped bottom. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and hit C on the keyboard, make this editable. I'm going to, it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to be in polygons mode. That's going to be easiest. I'm going to use the loop selection tool, which I can select up here, or I can hit UL. And sorry, not loop selection. I don't even know what I'm doing. I want to use the knife tool, the loop cut tool, which is here. It may be under the line cut icon instead, or you can just hit K and then L on the keyboard. And I'm going to go in. I want to leave the edges a little bit thick because I know it's going to round a fair amount. So I want to do that. Then I'm going to go and use my selection tool. I'm going to select those inner polygons. I'm going to hit the letter D, or I can click on this icon here. And I'm going to click and drag off an empty space somewhere and set this in just a little bit. Okay. And then, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn some things back on. I'm going to get out of solo mode, and I'm going to go ahead and uncheck this, uncheck that, go back to object mode, zoom out a little bit so I can actually see these mid legs, and then let's go ahead and turn on our volume builder and volume mesher. And you can see with the smooth setting that I currently have on there, right, I'm not actually seeing those, the results of that. And so that's something where maybe I need to go back in and just say, well, what does this look like if I just turn the smoothing off entirely? Right? It's a little bit chunkier and a little bit weirder. However, I do have those suction cup insets. I could also attempt to select this leg and go back to polygons mode, and I still have those polygons selected, so I could just use the move tool and pull these up more and see if that makes a stronger effect. And once I've done that, maybe I go back to the volume builder and see if the smooth is going to smooth it too much. It still looks like it's smoothing it a lot. So maybe what I'll do is I'll turn the smooth on, but I'm going to set my strength even lower. So I get like a little bit of smoothing, but just not too much. And you'll note, like, I could probably tuck this in a little bit, but there's some other things we're going to do that we need to talk about with the volume builder, because, right, it's kind of frustrating that I can't use any of this smoothing and really have things look the way I want to, because things are still kind of bunched out, the edges are hard, and there's a setting in here we haven't talked about yet. You'll note that if I go to my mid legs, there's this radius option. If I go ahead and click and drag on this radius, what I want you to see is basically what it's doing is it's stretching out and softening the how these points are interpolated. If it's set to 0, it's a much harder corner. If it's set higher, it's a much bigger corner, right? I can crank this way up and we can get some really bizarre results. But right, I can set this up and just keep boosting it until it looks more like the legs on my caterpillar, right? This might be a little bit much. I might actually want this to be down more like at like 15 or something like that. But once I'm happy with that, I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to the back legs. I'm going to put that at about the same distance. And then the front legs, I think are just a little different. Those are a little bit harder, but I might add just a tiny, tiny touch, right? And so there, now we've got this, that feature is really awesome. And you'll see, right, I'm still having some of this faceting going on, but I'm not super concerned about that because we can, when we use the remesher, it's going to fix that. So the last thing I want to do is I want to add suction cups to these back 2 legs, and then we will get to remeshing. So let's see here, back legs, let's open this up, select our back leg object, go into solo mode. Maybe we'll just be able to see that leg. Oh, it's all hidden. So we will go ahead and turn some things off. There we go. We're going to make this editable. We are going to use our loop cut tool, K and then L. Bring this out to about there. Hit the space bar, select this inner part, hit the letter D and off in space, click and drag and tuck that in a little bit. Maybe a little deeper than we think we'd want because of the smoothing and everything else that's happening. Turn this all back on and go back to object mode, and look at that. We have got a lot of things going on. Now the bottom of this caterpillar is a little bit flat, but we're not going to worry about too much about that right now. Okay, so this is a really good point to save your work. And we're going to start collapsing all of this down. So let's go ahead and collapse the volume builder, collapse the volume mesher. And then what I want to do is I want to copy this and paste it. Oops, I don't know, I must have hit the wrong button there. Oh, but I did paste it, that's great. And then I'm going to hide this one because what we're going to do is we are going to make this one editable so it just becomes a mesh. The reason for this is it just, as we go, it's going to make this process easier. But if we've made a mistake or we realize we want to change something using some of the parametric abilities that we've got with some of the objects in here, then we want to be able to go back and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on this and I'm just going to say make editable. And when I do that with a volume mesher, it basically just turns everything I've done into a single mesh, which is pretty fantastic. Okay, so I've got this meshed. So let's go ahead and use our remesher. So I'm going to go ahead and come in here, go down to remesh. I'm going to make this a child of the remesher. And it's going to think a little bit because it takes a bit to process that geometry. And so once it's done this, you will see that I have a much more uniform mesh across this surface, right? Now there are several settings. You can kind of see how the how the ends are looking on these antennae, but there's several settings that we need to be aware of and we need to make use of with this remesher. So I'm going to select the remesher. I'm going to come over here, and one of them is the mesh density, right? That's basically, it's at 100%, it's what it should be when it started. If we adjust that some, we typically want to go down. But so we're going to go ahead and leave the mesh density at 100% right now. The first thing we're going to change is this symmetric X here, right? So what that does is it will create symmetry in this mesh along whichever axis you select. In our case, we want this, right? All of our symmetry is happening in the X direction, right? This is the Z, but we're having symmetrical things happening on the left and right side of the X axis. So if I check mark X, what this does is it means that there is a seam that goes straight down the middle of the object, and the mesh on this side is going to mirror the mesh on this side. If I uncheck that, you'll see that when it works through this, it's going to be slightly different. it's going to think about it really hard. But right, you can see that it's all kind of slanted a little bit, right? It's not even. And you can even see here where it's like snaking along that surface, right? So whereas when I do this, it makes it symmetrical. In order for this to work, you have to have your object centered on the axis that you want to be doing symmetry across, right? So if you aren't centered on that axis, really strange things happen. So if I was to temporarily turn the remesher off, select my volume mesher and scoot this over a little bit, and then attempt to remesh this, I am going to get some really... Oh, actually, I'm a liar. It did it anyway. That's awesome. Okay, I thought it was going to freak everything out for a second, but it didn't. Fantastic. That's an update. Or maybe I just know how to use it better now. Okay, so we've got this set to 100%, but typically, right, in order for these models to weigh less, to be easier to use, and also actually to do some smoothing on here, we generally want to adjust our mesh density and adaptiveness. I'm going to drop the adaptiveness down to 0 to start with. And I want you to note, you can go back and forth as you want, but basically what that means is that these polygons are all going to be almost exactly the same dimensions. They're going to be as close as possible to being square, right? To being the same size. And then let's go ahead and set our mesh density to, oh, that was a little bit more than I wanted to. Let's go to 50%. Okay, so I've got 50%, and you'll see when I come up here, my antennas start doing some weird things, right? Those are not looking so hot. And most of the other details look pretty good at 50%, but these antennae don't. So let's go ahead and see what happens if we boost this up to about 60%. Right, things look a little bit different, but I want you to note that it's still kind of getting a little bit small there. Okay, so no matter what I do, it seems like these are still problematic for me, right? With this mesh set the way it is, it just doesn't have enough geometry for the antenna to be smooth and uniform in the way I would like them to be, especially if I do 0 adaptiveness. So this is why we keep a backup copy, right? Because then if we've made this mistake, we can come back in here, we can hide this one temporarily and hide all of this just in case. Go to our volume mesher, go to our volume builder, and come down here and see if we can increase some of these settings to make this a little bit happier. So let's go ahead and see if we can boost the radius of this folder. One, that's going to make that, all that's going to do is really make this a little bit better. If I go to dilate and erode now, maybe I need to increase my strength here just a bit so that this thickens up at the end, or maybe make this offset, say 3 centimeters, right? Because I'm losing some dimension when I'm doing my mesh reductions later. Right? Maybe I just need this to be overall fatter. So I've set this offset to 4, and I've set the strength to 90%. So let's go ahead and see if this leads to a better result when we go to get these antenna remeshed. So now that I've done that, I can go ahead and copy this again, paste it, right click, go down, say make editable, and then let's go ahead and delete this one. And just use that same remesh, and let's drop our mesh in there. And then let's hide this other thing so we don't have all that intersection happening. Okay, so you can see, right, it's thinned everything out. Again, these antennas are probably a little bit hefty at the base, but that's all right. But we're getting a much better result on the ends of these antennas. So let's go ahead and see if now what happens as we reduce our mesh. Let's go down to 50% and see what these look like. Right, so even at 50% now, these look much better than they did before. And the same goes for the antenna on the other end of the model. And if I look down here at the bottom, you can see that, right, I'm getting really good, clean, even meshes on this entire object. zRemesher is kind of magical. I'm not going to lie. Okay, so I've got this set to 50% density. That's still a lot of polygons, and there's still some edges and things where I'd like it to be a little smoother. So there's a couple of things I could do to fix this. First, what I can do is I can make this editable. Right, so if I right-click on this remesh and say Make Editable, then I've got this mesh, and I can do another iteration on top of this. So if I go back through here and I come down to Remesh again, I can drop this into a remesher one more time, and instead of 100%, right, I can say, let's try 50% of our 50%. And the reason that this works so much better than trying to do it all in one pass is when you're starting, right, you're working with a really uneven mesh. And I'm going to set this back to 0 for my adaptiveness as well, just so you can kind of see how it splits this up and changes this, right? So by setting this down to 50% again, right, I've reduced the polygon count more. I've made this much easier to texture, UV unwrap. It's a lighter weight if it needs to go into, say, like a video game engine or something like that. And you can see I'm starting to hit the kind of the limits, especially on these antennae, right? That one is 4 polygons. This one's like 5. It looks like I might, because there's some variation in here, what I might need to do is push this up like 1 or 2% to get it to be a little bit more even. I've noticed that sometimes that happens where you just need a little nudge in one direction or the other, right? But so I've set this, down to 51% of the previous one, right? And if I go again, let's just see what happens. And I'm going to not make this one editable this time. I'm just going to go ahead and do this. It is expensive to do remeshes, and so you don't really want to have them stacked and just leave your scene like that, right? But so now, again, I've reduced that mesh substantially, and you can kind of see that, right, I'm starting to get this lower poly version of what's going on here. It might be too much at this point. And the other thing I've noticed is, right, it's a little bit, I'd say it's a little unhappy with being stacked. So let's go ahead and pull this one out. We're going to right click, we are going to say Make Editable, and let's see what the difference is when we drop this into our remesh. Right, already that looks cleaner and rounder. It's not faceted any longer. You will note that, right, I'm starting to get some wobbliness in here, and part of that is because, again, this is set to adaptiveness. If I dial that down, let's see if we get, right, we've basically gotten down to as small as we can go with these poor antennae. Right, if I was to go 50% lower on this, I'm going to start losing details pretty dramatically. So really, this level that I had here is probably about where I want it to be. I could maybe try and go a little lower, or conversely, let's go ahead and undo this. Let's keep going. Okay, so this is our remesh 1. This is the one that we're working with. Let's make sure that, that one's not even on. Let's see here. Okay, let's go back one more step. There we go. Let's get this out of here. Okay, so with this, something I did neglect to do was turn symmetry on, so that might help us a little bit as well with this 51%. Things should be a little bit more uniform now. You can see these are actually identical. So I might be able to go back down to 50. But you'll see as soon as I start getting down here, there's a point where things start to go sideways. And I just want you, I'm just stepping down through the percentages. You can see that sometimes you actually go the right number of units down. Like if I set this to 40%, right, I'm getting a pretty good, I'm still getting a pretty good result at 40% with this. you know, there's a little bit of tweakiness here right at the ends, but that's something that I could make this editable. I could grab this one singular point and drag it back where I want it to go. There's no reason why, you know, I wouldn't do that. And at this point, I actually have like a really good uniform, low density mesh that is going to be great for texturing and UV unwrapping and everything else. As we get into UV unwrapping, you're going to notice that things go sideways pretty quickly if you have a high density mesh. Cinema will crash if you try and do something that's too thick, and you will just have a really hard time. So you want something that's not crazy dense, but it's just enough to make things smooth and uniform. And we'll talk more about why uniform polygons are important when we get to UV unwrapping. Okay, so that's how to use the remesher and the volume builder to create some types of organic forms. Oh, and we can probably, I don't know where my leg spikes went. Oh, they're part of this. I think they're a child of this. Let's go ahead and pull this up. There we go. Now we've got our leg spikes back. And you can see that those look pretty good. They might need to be a little bit narrower than they were before, but they are pretty great. So let's go ahead and I'm going to set the bottom radius to 7.